I'm JJ Perez from Inside Runner Sports. That is Greg Luca from the San Antonio Express News. We are coming to you the day after UTSA takes down Temple 51-27. Greg, the Roadrunners win 3 games in a row, get to the 6-win total, and clinch a potential bowl berth. What were your biggest takeaways from that? It's got to be just reaching bowl eligibility for a fifth straight year, right?
Yeah, it's a lot of the same stuff we talked about last week from that perspective, just the resiliency from the low points of that 3-5 start to then get through with bowl eligibility. But I thought to get more specific on this week, what was made it sort of interesting and a little bit different of a narrative was the extent to which the seniors who were all kind of honored before the game, it seemed like everybody kind of had their moment in a way that made a huge impact on the game. Maybe you talk about Robert Henry had 2 touchdowns and he had the 88-yard run, which is the longest in the program's or second longest gain from scrimmage in the program's history. Chris Carpenter returned a kickoff for a touchdown, and he had a huge block for Owen McCown's 75-yard touchdown, and that was after he was involved in muffing a punt. And I think later in the game ended up he was like targeted on a play that ended up being an interception. He might have had a better play on the ball than what ended up being made there. So a lot of interesting kind of ups and downs for him, which sort of spoke to the resilience of the group, right? The way that they've all sort of taken a blow this year and then they have not folded or they've not tapped out, as Jeff Traylor says all the time, and have continued to sort of push towards this point where they're at now. And, you keep going down the line. I mean, Zay Frazier said he's going to leave for the NFL, and he did the whole senior day thing, and he had 2 interceptions, and now he's got the program record. Jamari Robinson, his last home game, 4 sacks and 5.5 tackles for loss, which is a school record. And I'm sure I'm missing 1 or 2 guys in there as well, but it seemed like everybody who was super relevant from that senior group sort of had their moment.
Brandon Brown played well, Martavius French, Elliot Davison. And you look at a lot of these single digit guys, right? These are some of the guys that have struggled, right? To kind of put where UTSA is at this spot in this season. To see them go out on senior night, you never know what to expect. A lot of emotions, right? Jeff Traylor said he was crying in the elevator on the way down to the team meeting, and there it seemed like for the most part, it was not a perfect game. It probably wasn't their best game of the season, but for the most part, they were able to harness that emotion into positive play.
Yeah, Willie McCoy was the other one that I meant to
Right.
mention.
Yeah.
He had like a 40-yard catch and then he came back with a touchdown grab immediately. And so, yeah, no, I don't want to overstate all the emotional part in playing through it because every team does that every year whenever their senior day comes around. But I do think for this group, just the symbolically, just the extent to which people thought that this season was over and you could kind of pack it in and the way that they sort of had other ideas and really brought it to fruition here down the stretch.
Let's talk about the way this game played out, right? It was a game of big plays. I mean, from the very beginning throughout the fourth quarter, we saw big kind of game changing plays, and UTSA made enough of them. Temple for sure made their fair share, and that does not need to go unsaid. But pretty memorable game from that aspect. A lot of big plays. I think we'll remember the Chris Carpenter kickoff return is something that's going to go down in history. Owens 75-yard rush is going to go down in history. What do you make from all these home runs we saw last night?
Yeah, I think it'll probably mess with the evaluation of the defense a little bit because UTSA they had a muffed punt, so that's an extra possession. They had a kickoff return, so that's essentially an extra possession. Then they had the Owens touchdown. The run was a 2-play drive. Willie McCoy's touchdown was a 2-play drive, and what's the running with the 88-yard
Yeah.
gain. Robert Henry is the name it was blanking on there for whatever reason was the 2-play drive too. So they were scoring so quickly on offense that the defense was back out there a lot, and that's probably how the time of possession ended up even. But you look at how many times, I mean, they forced 5 3-and-outs in the first half and ended up doing a lot of stuff down the stretch with the 2 turnovers and the 3 turnovers on downs late over there in the second half. So it was a really strong game for the defense. That I think the 27 points is a little bit misleading. Obviously, they had the one breakdown with Denver Harris. They got beat on the deep ball, but other than that, they seem to do a pretty good job of keeping everything under wraps. The other like convincing drive was sort of like a 2-minute drill kind of situation at the end of the first half. So really, you take away those two, or even if you don't, I mean, on aggregate, it's a pretty
Yeah.
good day for the defense.
Yeah, I mean, let's stay right there with the defense. Jamori Robinson, you mentioned his career day. I said something post game like the the single sack leader and tackles for loss leader isn't, Marcus Davenport or Trey Moore or any other name you would expect. It's Jamori Robinson, 16 tackles for loss for the Roadrunners as a team. Man, they were just they've stayed aggressive this last month, and that really has impacted how well this defense has performed. And honestly, it was a dominant effort in that first half, and save for, that interception, maybe this game might have been kind of out of hand at halftime.
Yeah, I mean, you look at Temple's first, it was like 4 or 5 drives. It was like half the time they snapped the ball, it was going to be a negative play. And they started to get a little bit more of a footing as the game went on, where it wasn't so dominant. But there was a lot of things that UTSA did that was giving them trouble. And it's hard to say schematically how the matchup was going to be, handled, because Temple going through the coaching change and whatever Everett
Yeah.
Withers was going to try to bring in there or do a little bit differently in his first game, sort of at the reins and making those type of calls, or at least sort of organizing the game plan, kind of however he thought it would be best to attack this defense. And UTSA, we've seen them take a varied approaches week to week too. Some weeks they feel pretty content to sit back and play coverage, and other weeks they're really going to try to get after you. And sometimes they can do both if the front four or front seven is dominant enough that they can create pressure without having to bring extra numbers. So I think this was a game where you saw that instead of leaning on the coverage aspect of it, they leaned more on that pass rush aspect, and those guys really delivered.
Let's talk about the rushing game. UTSA amasses over 300 yards of rushing for the second consecutive game. This week felt a little bit more different than last week's rushing performance, Greg. Was UTSA more successful?
I don't know that I would say that. There was plenty of times they tried to run for,
Yeah.
they had a,
Short
There was
yardage. The
third
short
and
yardage
three.
was
They did,
still, yeah.
yeah. There was like the 3rd and 3. They did the direct snap and they didn't get it. And then on 4th and 1, they ran the swing pass because they didn't believe they could run it up the middle, and they didn't get that. And then later in the game, they had a 3rd and 1 where they tried to run it up the middle and they just got stuffed. And I was trying to pull up the stats here real quick. I couldn't find it, but those numbers where it's like they only look at the first 5 yards because they think it sort of weights how the offensive line is impacting the level of play. And I bet they still didn't do great in that metric, because either they busted a big gain like the one we saw, or there were still a lot of plays that went for zero. I don't know that they got a ton of. I didn't feel like there were a ton of tackles for loss on the Temple side. Maybe I'm just
Yep.
misremembering, but so I mean, I don't think they were giving up a ton of negative plays. But this is not some team that's been great against the run or great defensively either. So you probably would want to see a better performance down to down. But I mean, you can't really get too upset about running for 309 yards, even if you take out the 88 for Robert Henry and the 75 for Owen McCown on those big plays. You still had a pretty strong total in the big picture. So again, you can't be too upset about that, but I don't think it was perfect, especially given the level of competition.
Yeah, but considering how the season has gone for the Roadrunners, especially with the run game, like you could argue just the lack of that home run. That's where UTSA, I mean, if you look at Kavorian Barnes from seasons ago and even before that, that home run on the rushing game was kind of a constant there, a threat. And we hadn't seen it until maybe last week, right? So that's part of the offense I think that's been missing. And let's be honest, it looks like Owen McCown has decided he's gonna be a better runner. He's picking his spots a little bit more, probably in the last month or so, and he looks to be a threat there.
Yeah, we talked about early in the season that I think people are going to be surprised by his athleticism, and it seemed like he didn't really have the opportunity to show it off a lot of times. Maybe it was just the way they were being defended, but as his passing game has improved, obviously you see more guys committed to coverage, and as they've gone farther down the field, you see more guys committed to deep areas, and so a lot of times, the safeties are watching the line of scrimmage, but the corners are, they turn and ran with guys, and maybe the same for the linebackers matched up with the UTSA's tight end group that we've talked about a lot. So then you end up with these situations where if Owen has a little bit of time, or if he's able to create some time with his legs, then he might look up and see that everybody's sort of cleared out underneath, and he's got 10 or 12 free yards before he even has to start thinking about beating somebody. And then potentially you end up in a situation like we saw yesterday, where he had to just get around that one linebacker, and I don't think that guy expected Owen to be as fast as he was, because he took a pretty bad angle to it when you have the full perspective of what Owen can do, and got beat to the sideline. And Chris Carpenter had that block that took out not just the corner, but then he went and got the safety as well. So suddenly Owen's got a 75-yard touchdown. And I think that we didn't talk about it a lot lately, but I do not think that this group of receivers has blocked on the perimeter as well as some of the teams we've seen in the past, where that was something they really hung their hat on quite a bit. So I believe that there's probably a little bit of a component of that of why we haven't seen those explosive run plays pop off the way we've seen in the past. And I wouldn't say that Chris Carpenter is like an elite blocker. That's not really what you think about when you consider his frame and his skill set. But on that play he delivered, and you saw the kind of impact that can make.
Blocked two dudes on that play. Very, very impressive. So, uh, I want to talk a little bit about the special teams. We saw a surprise onside kick that UTSA was apparently ready for. We saw a kickoff return and I guess okay execution on field goal attempts. What was your takeaways on special teams, Greg?
Yeah, it was interesting to see Chase Allen get back out there and
Yeah.
kick one. I don't know if that was just a senior day thing or if potentially on short yardage, he's the guy they still trust more from an accuracy perspective. I mean, that one was only like 20 or 25 yards. So if that was the case, you would think we'd see him kicking extra points, which we haven't seen. So maybe it was just an opportunity to get him out there and get him a look on senior day. That would not be out of character for Jeff Traylor. But then of course, Tate had shanked the last attempt before that. I mean, it was like a 50-yarder. I don't want to make it sound like he missed a gimme, but he was really kind of off the mark on that one. So maybe from that perspective, there was something that might have been off with him that they wanted to go to Chase Allen. That's all just kind of speculating. But it was just interesting to see because Tate's been so good this year. It's been, I think, surprising to anybody who might have wondered why he didn't have the job prior to that point, given the type of production we've seen from him. And obviously, Chase was awesome last year and was a finalist for national recognition this year, so, or on a watch list for that sort of thing. So you sort of get maybe they had two good options, but to see what Tate's brought this year has been really impressive, and to have Chase have an opportunity on his last home game to contribute a little bit was cool too. And yeah, I thought everything else was kind of probably about to form. The way they recovered that onside kick sort of makes you remember how impressive it is that they've had the success with the surprise onside kicks that they have, because I think, a lot of credit obviously goes to the coaching staff of identifying where the weakness is in the opposing kick return unit. They might not have somebody who is as attentive or positioned in the right way to attack that. And the focus of those guys up front too, to not just be like, okay, this is the part where I run backwards, like you have to
Yeah.
be ready if the kick comes short that you're going to go scoop it up. And so it shows sort of a little bit of a sharpness and an attention to detail that if you looked at the first few games of the year where things weren't necessarily going great, that's the kind of stuff that you felt like they weren't doing an awesome job at. So just another sign of the way they've kind of picked it up and turned it around as the year's going on.
And Chris Carpenter now has three returns for a touchdown, two kickoffs, and one punt. Going to
Yep,
be
and I
in
think
the UTSA history books for a very long time.
yeah, this kickoff I think matched the longest play, which was his 97 yards again. And then we talked about Robert Henry, his 88-yard run. There was a 92-yard run from Jarvion Williams, but um, so this is second in that regard, and it's just interesting to see those kind of records. I mean, Zay Frazier's got the interception record with 6 and did it in 3 2-interception games, which is kind of strange. You wouldn't think that that's how that would come together, and so I think it's what's that 4 in the last 2 weeks for him
Yeah.
too. So I guess we'll see sort of what that leads to for him in the rest of the season. He's obviously kind of stepped up a level where you wonder why teams are even throwing his direction now.
The Roadrunners are riding a 10-game home winning streak. Pretty good November record under the last 5 years under Jeff Traylor. Man, what is it about this team? They just turn it on at this as every year. It's just November to remember. And especially this year, you wouldn't have thought this November would have gone this way.
Yeah, well, I think from an injury perspective, they've either figured out how to adjust to the guys that they are playing without, or they're starting to get guys back, like we talked about what David Amador's done for this offense. And I don't know that any of the wrinkles were highly successful yesterday, but we saw them still be able to throw some curveballs at Temple that I think might have kept them off balance and helped contribute to the success that you saw in other areas. And so, we were going through the pregame stretch. It just seemed like they didn't have as many guys down and out as you'd seen in the past, or the guys who you were uncertain about actually ended up playing, where it didn't feel like they were taking any unnecessary losses from the injury perspective, and that's probably continued to help them as they've getting back closer to full strength. I know they're probably still hoping Devin McEwen gets out there by the end of the season, but other than that, I think a lot of the guys who aren't there are considered season-ending guys, and otherwise they are kind of in a decent position as far as the health situation goes. So I think that's making an impact too, and I just think it's been proven with this staff that they do a pretty good job of figuring out what they're good at as
Yeah.
the year goes on and sort of specializing in that and leaning more that direction rather than just sort of the ideal of what they want to be or whatever they thought they might be coming into the season. And I think that they generally, this group, I think, probably does a pretty good job with scouting and identifying opponents' weaknesses and how you want to attack them. And so as you get deeper into the season and those opponents have sort of solidified who they are, probably by about the midpoint of the year, and they've just put more and more on film that you can break down and look for weaknesses in, I think that that sort of advantage starts to shine through too. So beyond just all the culture stuff of the extent to which they practice the right way and kind of stick with the focus on getting better, even if the results haven't been awesome. And, all those things that sound kind of cliche, but do seem like they really carry some weight with this culture. I think that there's a tactical part of it too that's been pretty important to why they've had so much success here. I don't know. Do you see anything?
Yeah, no, I just agree with you 100% on the tactical side of it, right? Sometimes it takes a little bit to figure out. I mean, last season Frank Harris was banged up most of the year, right? And you get how do you figure out how to use him that way? How do you figure out what is the most efficient way to get Owen going offensively when you have a wide receiver group that's decimated? You know what I mean? So with basically no run inside run to deal with. So I think they've done well adjusting to your point on the fly. So Greg, the Roadrunners hit the 6-win total. One game left in the regular season, probably another bowl game for the Roadrunners. The potential for a 7 or 8 win season. I mean, neither of those are going to be easy feats, but considering where they were at 3-5 after a just brutal collapse at Tulsa a month ago, where does this season kind of fall in how it's gone? I mean, the story's still unwritten, right? But it it isn't the lost season a lot of people thought it was.
Yeah, I think probably when people look back at it in the big picture, I guess the Army game could be pretty important to what that ultimate perspective is if UTSA is able to go up there and pull off an upset. But I would, it's interesting because you would think based like personnel and what UTSA's strengths are that they would have a chance in that sort of a matchup because they might do well against Army's run game. But you would have said the same thing every other year, and they haven't always had great results against that team. So especially with the strength that Army's shown this season being kind of a step ahead of those other teams that we've seen in the past that UTSA struggled with even then. I feel like it would be hard to say that you have any read on what's going to happen in that game. So assuming really either way for that one, I think this season will be looked back at. Obviously, probably not as strong as the two conference championship seasons, and even last year it was a story of being right in the mix in the new league and ending up coming down to the final week for a chance to play for a championship in that league. And so I think this year, obviously from a pure wins and losses and just objective success standpoint, it's not going to be at as high of a level, but I think it was an important lesson about the strength of the culture when things aren't going well because we hadn't seen that tested. And so sure there is room to be concerned about all the things that weren't going well and why they weren't going well, but I do think that the lesson you can take away is that all the stuff that they sort of preach that sounds like coach speak and sounds like just sort of the kind of cliche things that you say about the culture and your building as a football program that everybody probably says to some extent or another, that it carries a lot of weight and has a lot of validity with this team because they've shown that even when things aren't going well, because usually when you see stuff like that start to crumble, that they still sort of live by it and that it can lead them to a turnaround.
Yep. As in life, sometimes you learn more about yourself when things aren't going well than you do when things are going well. So I'd agree with that 100%. I do think it is very important and will be extremely significant for whatever bowl game UTSA gets to if they're able to win a back-to-back bowl game, right? Like you're talking about a program that just won their first bowl game last season. So that'll be certainly interesting to watch. Who knows where UTSA is going to go? It just kind of feels like after following the bowl process the last few years, they kind of slot you wherever they feel like, and you get what you get. So, what's do you have a preference, Greg? Are you trying to get back to Florida or Frisco or
I
Myrtle?
feel like I feel like I'm not even plugged in with the tie-ins this year. I'll take anything that's a little bit different because that could be fun. But yeah, to your point, I mean, I, this season might feel like a missed opportunity in some ways because of how highly the expectations were pumped up before the season. But I do think when you sort of look at it big picture, I mean, next year's team might be set up to succeed, just as much, if not more, because it's easy to say I bet we'll be good on defense this year because we have all of our guys back. But then when you realize like how good, what are the peaks that this defense has hit in recent years? Like this has been a team that thrived off of offense. So just because you had all those guys back didn't mean that this was going to be the kind of dominant group that they expected that it might be. And so I guess what I'm saying is I feel better about the Roadrunners' chances of success when you know their offense is going to click, which you probably should feel that way based on what you've seen this year and how the depth chart projects for next season, provided nobody ends up leaving or having anything like that come into play. So I think maybe the expectations can be matched a little bit easier in a year where you're expecting the offense to carry the workload than when you came into a season like this expecting the defense to be the one doing the heavy lifting. So perhaps there's we and I think we've sort of tried to not get too doom and gloom. But I think especially now, it's easy to see the room for optimism in
Yep.
future seasons.
Yep. And it just, I mean, part of me just feels like this is how life is going to be in the G5, right? Like maybe UTSA got a little spoiled with some of their initial success, but these seasons have a way of ebbing and flowing. So we'll see what changes are in store for the Roadrunners. It's never too early to start looking towards next season. Obviously, there's conversations with red shirts, right? Like who's playing, who's gonna maybe come back and play in the bowl because that doesn't count. Signing day is less than 2 weeks away, a week and a half, I believe, the early period. The UTSA had three official visitors, JUCO visitors at the game yesterday. And then the portal impact, right? Things change. Jeff talked about what he thought his team was going to look like next year. And to your point, there is reason for optimism, especially on the offensive side.
Yeah, I guess you're thinking about, the G5 level, it's going to fluctuate every year. It depends going forward in the new era who's willing to commit to what level. If certain programs are making a much larger commitment to paying players than others, then you would think that those teams will hover near the top every year. But I mean, it's just like anything else. Like just because you have the best chance of succeeding doesn't mean every year is going to be a great year for you. But I do think you could start to see some separation there just based on how teams approach the way college football is going to operate going forward. But generally, I do think you're right where you would think that the power programs are scooping up all of the most reliable
Yeah.
players, you know what I mean? And so then you're sort of rolling the dice at this level and below of who's actually going to be able to step up and deliver a great season. And we saw this year, I think they brought in a lot of flawed is probably a really harsh word, but I hopefully you know what I'm trying to say of like guys who don't have the perfect resume, where in some extent or another, you're taking a chance on the transfer player you brought in, either because there was something off the field or because their production hadn't been there, but you thought the talent was there, or the other way around, where you'd seen them produce at a different level, and now you want to see if they can do it here. And I think maybe the hit rate wasn't necessarily as high as far as the return of the standout players in year one as UTSA has been able to achieve in the past, which puts into perspective how good some of those impact transfers that they've brought in the past few years were. But to that extent, yeah, because you're not able to get the perfect players the way that some of the big boys might be able to, there is going to be probably a little bit of fluctuation there year to year. And I think it'll be under the microscope next season because they lost like 10 defensive starters.
Yep.
And that's actually kind of low. Like if you add in the guys who they replaced in some cases, that you have like your Ken Robinson and your Joe Evans, and then they got replaced by guys who are now also leaving. It feels like they lost like 13 starters or some impossible number. So it'll be interesting to see how they reload on that end and what that looks like.
Yep. I think it'll be very interesting. The Roadrunners wrap up the regular season next week at Army. Greg, you'll be at West Point. I'll be at home watching it on TV. So we'll figure out a way to wrap that one up and then see where the Roadrunners are headed for the bowl game. If it's an early one, we may know as soon as sometime next week, right? And who knows where UT or ESPN and the bowl people decide to put the Roadrunners. So I think that'll wrap it up. Greg, you got anything else?
No, I think that'll do it. I appreciate you doing this as always. It's been good, and I don't know if we gave enough of a shout out to 6-0 home record and 0-5 on the road, so we'll see how that goes this week. But I think that's an interesting dynamic. I just wanted to highlight quickly.
The home record. I mean, they don't lose at home, right? 29-3 under Jeff. So we'll see if they could turn that around next week at West Point. So that'll wrap it up. I appreciate everybody watching. A lot of people. I really appreciate you guys come up to us. To me, I see people, hey, thanks for doing this video. It's one of my favorite things. It's one of our favorite things to do. So we appreciate all of you guys watching. We'll be back next week. I'm JJ Perez, Inside Runner Sports. Greg Lucas, San Antonio Express News. Thanks for watching, everybody.